Hello, hello, welcome back to Loki's Librarian. If you are new here, welcome. I am your librarian, Katrina, and on Sundays I do a thing called Books and Booze, where I review a book and mix up a cocktail in the process. It is the last Sunday of the month, so it's time for the next president, making this week's book An Ordinary Man, The Surprising Life and Historic Presidency of Gerald R. Ford by Richard Norton Smith. The accompanying cocktail is going to be a classic gin and tonic, which was Ford's second favorite cocktail. The first was a martini, which I made up once before and didn't like. So we're going to go with the second one, gin and tonic, which is 2 ounces of gin, 4 ounces of tonic water, and lime for garnish. So let's do this. Gerald R. Ford was born Leslie Lynch King Jr. on July 14, 1913, to Leslie Lynch King Sr. and Dorothy Ayer Gardner King. This was not a happy marriage, as shortly after saying I do and leaving on their honeymoon, King Sr. began abusing his young wife, physically, verbally, mentally, all of the above. He was just basically a prick of a human being. And she became pregnant shortly after an argument. The author speculates at marital rape. We're never going to know, obviously. Regardless, she left her husband as soon as they got back from the honeymoon, and then was more or less shamed by, I want to say, her in-laws into giving him a second chance, even though her mother-in-law absolutely despised her. Don't know why, but she did. This is built in the glass. I gotta get the glass over here. Not sure if I'm gonna have enough room in this glass. They reconciled. She was living at his family residence in Omaha, Nebraska, when she gave birth to the son, to King Jr. The abuse didn't stop. It actually became very loud and violent, and like law enforcement had to come and restrain him from the residence. And about 2 weeks after Jr. was born, I'm just going to call him Jr. because it'll make sense in a moment here. Jr. is a fairly stable name to go with at this point in time. The abuse did not stop. Dorothy left King for good about 2 weeks after Jr. was born. King Sr. sued for divorce, citing spousal desertion on August 21st, and Dorothy countersued, seeking alimony and legal fees. And that violent, messy legal outbreak where the law enforcement got involved and restrained King Sr. from the residence, well, that came back to bite him in the ass because, unusually, Dorothy won her suit. Ah! Whoa! Oh, that foamed up but good, didn't it? Nice. I did have room in the highball glass. I'm impressed. Dorothy sued for alimony and child support, and she won, which is unusual for early 20th century divorce proceedings. She had taken up residence in her aunt's house in Chicago, in a Chicago suburb. Eventually, she relocated to Grand Rapids, Michigan, with her parents, and it was there that she would meet Gerald Rudolph Ford Sr. He was actually not senior when she met him. He was just Gerald Rudolph Ford. He quickly fell in love with the beautiful divorcee from, Nebraska thereabouts. No, I should have stirred this first. We will gently stir it now, and then I'll throw in the second lime wedge. Boom. Very full gin and tonic. Gerald Rudolph Ford was not actually senior at the time. However, he fell quite in love with Dorothy and her 3-year-old son, and they married in 1917. However, the church they were part of, I think it was the Episcopalian, but I might be wrong, would not let them marry in church due to Dorothy's status as a divorcee. I mean, not all things were awesome in the early 20th century, but they did marry, at least legally, and young King eventually took his stepfather's name in honor of the man who raised him and became Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr. So Sr. became a senior after Jr. adopted his name in honor of the man who actually, raised and fathered him. Ford eventually met his birth father, and it was kind of a fraught relationship. I mean, Ford would eventually get his mother a lawyer to sue for back alimony and child support. It's fitting that he was President Ford and not President King, because, King Sr. was a bit of a shit. That's okay. The tonic kind of drowns out the gin. If you like the flavor of gin, this kind of drowns it out. I mean, it's okay. It's drinkable. I'm definitely getting the citrus hints from the lime. So, I don't know. Anyway, Ford, growing up, was quite athletic as a youth. I mean, he played football all through college. He loved to ski. He was a great golfer. He was so good, he was actually drafted by 2 NFL teams, the Green Bay Packers and the Detroit Lions. The Lions, after he had played a demo game against the Chicago Bears. So he was an outstanding athlete. And here's the thing. Most people tend to think of Ford as just the dumb jock. I mean, when I told my husband about Ford being drafted for the NFL, He was like, oh yeah, I think Ford, I think, I play football, and kind of did this like goofy, dumb jock voice, right? Ford turned down those offers and accepted a position as assistant coach while at Yale, with the Yale football team, so that he could attend Yale Law School, where he maintained a B average the entire time he was working as a coach and doing the full-time student thing. So, and this was in a time when they did not grade on a curve. So yeah, he was a smart man. All right, people tend to look past that when people, this country has become very divided in the jock and nerd categories, and they tend to think you're one or the other. And Ford was kind of both. He was a very smart man to maintain a B average at Yale, of all places. That is a top tier law school, was back then, is today, right? He was incredibly smart, and he knew he wanted to go into public service after the war. Okay, the war hadn't started. He actually graduated in the top third of his class in 1941. And he was admitted to the Michigan bar in May of 1941. And he was practicing with his friend Phil Buchan, I'm probably mispronouncing the last name, when Pearl Harbor happened on December 7th, 1941, and the country was headed to war. Now, he actually sent out 2 feelers at this point in time. He sent one to the FBI and one to the Office of Naval Intelligence. And he was actually interviewed for the FBI and cut quite an impressive figure at 6 feet tall. He was the peak of physical health due to the continued fitness regime. I mean, he swam like a half mile a day, regular played golf. He was a big sports guy. Hoover did not pick him up. Now, whether this was because of a knee injury he had sustained as a result of college football or as a result of his isolationist opinions, which had been expressed while in college, it's literally something we're never going to know, right? It could be either or. Probably because of Hoover. Hoover had a very definite look. He liked his agents, and Ford fit the figure. Most likely it was his isolationist tendencies, which Hoover was like, oh no, we can't have that. Regardless, Ford had no hard feelings for the man. He always held Hoover in high esteem, and nominated him for awards or something when he was in Congress. I don't remember specifically. He didn't take it personally. All right. The government does not actually give you a reason when they send you a politely worded fuck off letter. They just tell you to fuck off. And so he did. He went to the Office of Naval Intelligence, and they were happy to accept him. And he joined the Navy, U.S. Navy, or Navy Reserve, I don't remember which. And he was ultimately stationed on the USS Monterey, where he definitely saw action. It was a big battleship. Barely managed to survive a Typhoon Cobra. They just barely pulled through. I mean, they actually had permission to abandon ship from Admiral Halsey, and the captain, because Ford was on deck and because of actions forged during the typhoon, managed to save the ship. So it's impressive. All right, he was a fucking man in an age of men. My God. Now, when he returned from the war, started to return to law with his longtime friend Phil Buchan. Now, they had the practice prior to. Buchan never served because he had polio when he was a child, so he was medically exempted. Buchan was, so while Ford left, Buchan shut down the joint practice and joined another law firm, to which Ford was welcomed wholeheartedly when he returned from active duty. He worked as a lawyer until 1948, when he ran for a position with the U.S. House of Representatives for Michigan's 5th District, which he represented in Congress from 1949 when he was sworn in until 1973, when he was tapped to be vice president following the disgraced resignation of VP Spiro Agnew, which I mentioned briefly during the book on Nixon last month. Now, sometime in, I think it was 1947, he met Elizabeth Ann Warren, maiden name Bloomer. Betty was actually married when they met, but in the process of divorcing her first husband, which Ford would push for an ecclesiastical dissolution as well as legal, so that when they married, they could marry in a church. Betty was a trained dancer. No joke, she trained under Martha Graham, literally. Martha Graham, if you know anything at all about dance in the 20th century, she was one of the big ones. She was a big name. She gave us a lot. I mean, Ford would eventually give Martha Graham the Medal of Freedom? Presidential Medal of Freedom, I think, for her contribution to arts. Ultimately, Betty chose to move back to Michigan, and I think it was to help her mom out, if I'm remembering from the book. It was when she was back in Michigan that she met her first husband, and it wasn't working out. She was going to divorce him anyways when he fell into a diabetic coma. Betty was a decent human being. Like, no joke. When her husband fell into a coma, she could have basically just left him to his fate and taken the easy way out and become a widower versus a divorcee, but she didn't. She nursed her first husband back to health and then divorced his ass. So, man, it's ironic drinking a gin and tonic for Betty Ford, but that takes some guts, man. A lot of women would have been like, ain't working anyways, you're on your own, pal, and just left him to his fate. It's the easy way out. Now, when he had returned from war, got himself set up in his law practice, Ford asked friends of his if they had any recommendations for available young ladies, and his friends connected him with Betty Warren, and the rest is history. They would marry and have 4 children, 3 boys, Michael, Jack, and Stephen, and 1 surprise daughter, Susan. Now, Ford genuinely liked being a congressman. He liked representing the people of the 5th District. He never really had any ambitions to make the leap to the executive. He did aspire to be Speaker of the House. That was something he very much wanted to do, which would require the Republicans to be a majority party in the House while he held some seniority. I mean, he was never going to be Speaker when he was a freshman congressman. In the 24 years that he served, he made friends. I mean, across the aisle, both sides. I mean, on his side, he was on the other side. He was a friendly, centrist guy. And he made friends with people. He talked to people. He didn't just be like, oh, you're on the other side of the aisle. You're my sworn enemy. Which they incidentally don't do today. They just want you to think they do. But realistically, these are their colleagues. They have to get along together. They put on a show for the camera, and then the camera comes off, and if y'all remember from COVID, the masks come off too. He was put on various committees, as Congress critters are, including the House Appropriations Committee and the Defense Appropriations Committee. And he became well known as being this stand-up guy who's going to do the right thing. And in 1963, just days after the assassination of JFK, who he held in high regard owing to his general friendliness, I mean, again, he got along with everybody, LBJ called him and asked Ford to sit in on the Warren Commission, which is investigating the JFK assassination. And LBJ wanted a bipartisan commission, so he had people from both the Democrats and the Republicans doing this investigation. And the author does a pretty good job explaining the reservations Ford had at the beginning of the commission and how ultimately Ford accepted the narrative, including Ford's caveat that if more information came out, he'd be open to changing his mind. But as far as the information available at the time of the commission, JFK was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, who was in turn killed by Jack Ruby, and there was no grand conspiracy. It was just a random happenstance. And to be fair, that's all you can do, is you can only judge a situation based on the available information at the time that it happened, and that is what the information was. In 1965, Ford got as close as he would to his ambition when he was elected the House Minority Leader, a position he would hold until making the leap to the executive, which position he did not seek out. He was actually set to retire in 1976. I mean, like truly, that was his ambition, was to have his last election be 74. God willing, the Republicans would win, and then he could make Speaker of the House. But regardless, he was set to retire after in 76. He wanted to step down, let somebody else take over the 5th District for the 77 congressional year. But then Spiro Agnew. Agnew had been Nixon's VP for his first term and was elected for VP the second term, which began January 20th, 73. And 10 months later, October 10th, Agnew advised Nixon he would be retiring due to pending criminal charges filed against Agnew in his home state for tax evasion. And on October 20th, 73, Agnew pled guilty to tax evasion. So at this point, Nixon needs a VP. The 25th Amendment requires it. And he picked Ford. And it's not just because Ford was a House Minority Leader. The two of them were friends. They had been friendly their entire careers. I mean, for 25 years at this point, they had been friendly with each other. They worked together in the House of Representatives and on joint bills when Nixon was a senator, worked together when Nixon was VP under Eisenhower. So Ford was a logical pick based on party affiliation, based on his bipartisanship. He, like I said, he was well known and well liked on both sides of the aisle. He quickly flew through the required confirmation hearings, and all of this while Watergate was heating up. And the author speculates that certain factions in the House may have tried to delay Ford's confirmation, because if Nixon is impeached with no VP on hand, then the Speaker of the House, Carl Albert, a Democrat, would have been boosted into the highest position in the land based on the provisions of the 25th Amendment. I mean, it's good speculation. It certainly is an outstanding conspiracy theory. Didn't happen, obviously. Ford and Betty scrambled to make VP work from their 3-bedroom family home in Alexandria, Virginia. The Secret Service had absolute fits with security in this neighborhood. And the Fords did spend some time looking for a more suitable VP residence that the Secret Service could better secure. This was all happening as Watergate heated up. And since 1974 is an election year, between looking for a new VP residence, Ford was busy campaigning for Republicans all across the country ahead of the November elections. And on August 1st, Chief of Staff Alexander Haig told Ford that he should start preparing for the presidency. And I think it was August 8th. It may have been the 7th, but it was very shortly, days before, within 2 days of Nixon's retirement. Nixon called Ford into his office, where he spent basically 70 minutes on a crash course, bringing Ford up to speed on international politics and the State of the Union, and advised Ford that he would be resigning the next day. It had to have been the 8th because he resigned on the 9th. And then he did. And as Betty Ford said, most presidents get 3 months to transition. They had 24 hours. Okay, to be fair, LBJ, 3 months, right? Because obviously JFK's assassinated. LBJ's got to hit the ground running. He didn't even get a 70-minute brief before he had to take over. But she's got a fair complaint. There's a lot of hit and miss there during that quick of a transition. And with that, the Fords moved into the White House, and Ford did an absolutely remarkable job restoring honor to the presidency. And I'm not joking about that. There's no sarcasm or anything. He genuinely did a fantastic job restoring some faith in this office. He had to have a VP, requirements of the 25th Amendment, so he nominated Nelson Rockefeller, who was confirmed in December of 1974. He was asked so frequently about Watergate that he felt that it was impinging on his ability to actually lead the country, so he pardoned Nixon on September 8th, 1974. And this was a very controversial decision at the time, so much so that when he lost the presidency to Carter in 1976, most people then and now blame his pardon of Nixon as the reason he lost, which is certainly possible. It's also possible that Nixon's actions had so sullied the presidency that the nation wanted a shift. They wanted to see what the other party could do. Absolutely possible. Anyway, Ford hit the ground running. The pardon of Nixon was popular with hardline Republicans, and to kind of keep the balance, Ford proposed a conditional amnesty for draft dodgers and deserters. The condition being that basically an acknowledgement of those who had responded to the call and died in droves over in Vietnam. So the condition that he provided is that those who ran could earn their way back through public service. This was popular with some, not so much with others who believed there should have been an unconditional amnesty, others who felt there should be no amnesty and they should all just rot in jail for being deserters and draft dodgers. Ford just wanted the nation to pull together on the oars of the ship of state so that we could stop going in circles. And so he pushed through this amnesty. The other thing that probably seriously dented Ford's possible election in 1976 was April of 1975. This is when American troop withdrawals completed in Vietnam, and man, this was probably one of the most riveting chapters in the book, and he did an outstanding job detailing just how messy this was. And anyone who watched the shit show in Afghanistan in August of 2021 on the news, and that's pretty much exactly what it was like. All right, civilians running from the enemy, begging for help. Only Ford actually gave a shit and insisted on refugee status for those Vietnamese who managed to catch a ride out, ultimately settling 130,000 refugees. Now, that number comes from Wikipedia. Smith did not provide a total number in the book. He provided some pretty high numbers, but he didn't provide a total number of refugees. Wikipedia settled it at 130,000, so take that for what it's worth. Somewhere between 70 and 130,000, so... Ford then confronted an incident, almost immediately after that, May of 1975, off the coast of Cambodia, when Khmer Rouge forces seized a U.S. merchant ship, the Mayaguez. This became an international clusterfuck as the Marines sent in to rescue the sailors landed on the wrong island and engaged in battle while on another island. The sailors would be released. So you have Cambodia, a couple of islands off the coast. You have the ship over here, the sailors over here, the Marines were over here, and so it just kind of became a big mess. Ford then redeemed his international chops with Operation Paul Bunyan. So there's hits and misses. Paul Bunyan was a major response to North Korea's murder of U.S. troops in the demilitarized zone when these troops went out to cut down a tree that was blocking their view. It was required to be. This was actually addressed in Dear Reader, which I read a few years ago by Michael Malice. For more details specifically on this incident, the Fat Electrician did an outstanding video on just this incident. But the upshot is, Ford did good. It was a measured response. They achieved their goal. They actually got an almost apology from Kim Jong-il from North Korea. It was almost an apology. Of course, he could never actually apologize because he's infallible, because he's a fucking communist. They never admit they're wrong. In September of 1975, Ford survived 2 assassination attempts. I don't know what he's barking at. In September of 1975, Ford survived 2 assassination attempts. No joke, 2. Most famously, Lynette Squeaky Fromm, a follower of Charles Manson, made an attempt outside the Capitol building in Sacramento. This failed when Secret Service managed to get his hand in the slide. This prevented the firing pin from hitting the bullet in the Colt 1911 she had on her. She was in prison for this until 2009. She was released after Ford's death, a couple years after Ford's death, but still. The second attempt was a few weeks later in San Francisco, California, by Sarah Jane Moore when she fired at Ford with a .38 revolver. This attempt was stymied by retired Marine Oliver Sipple, who was immediately shit on by the press, who outed him as a homosexual, because that's what the media does. They fucking suck. For his part, Ford was an absolute centrist. I mean, no joke. He was not a racist. He was not sexist. He was not homophobic. The AIDS epidemic hit after he retired, but he was part of AIDS walks. He believed in marriage equality well before this was a political hot button. He supported Betty when she came out in favor of Roe v. Wade. It's also possible that Betty cost him the 1976 election by being very outspoken on women's rights. He didn't care. He wasn't going to shut his wife up. He loved her. He let her say her piece. She supported the Equal Rights Amendment also, which I know most people tend to think that that's a Democrat thing, but they were Republicans. And, I mean, as far back as his college football days at University of Michigan, so his undergrad days, he was pissed when the Wolverines were playing an away game in highly racist Georgia. It was one of the deep South states. It might have been Mississippi, Alabama. It was a deep South state, and the state refused to let at least one of Michigan's black players on the field. And Ford violently body checked the opposition a lot enough that their player was like, "Dude, thanks," but. I mean, he was pissed that this racism was going on. He did not abide by it. He thought people should be judged on their own merit. And one of the people he invited to the White House for a Presidential Medal of Freedom was Jesse Owens, who was snubbed by FDR, that political king of the left who, was the best thing ever, but wouldn't let a black man in the White House to give him a Presidential Medal of Freedom at the time that he actually won 4 medals at the Olympics. Ford redressed his problem, had Jesse Owens over, acknowledged his good. Now, Ford did address inflation as the number 1 issue domestically and actually listened to economists, which is absolutely shocking, who recommended cutting taxes and spending. In fact, the city of New York was on the verge of bankruptcy, and people were saying, "Oh, you should bail out New York," and he's like, "I'm not going to bail out New York. I will give them recommendations for, cut your fucking spending." And he made them do it. God bless him. He made New York cut their spending, and they did. They actually recovered. It was amazing. The economy was definitely on its way to recovery going into the 1976 election. It was during the Ford administration that economist Arthur Laffer made his famed Laffer curve, which shows if you decrease taxes, spending goes up because people have more money to spend. Yeah. He took that at face value, did exactly that, and what do you know? It worked. Ford took that into consideration when he was creating his domestic financial policy, but it was slow recovery because we were pretty deep in the hole at that point in time. On the other hand, Ford made an absolutely outstanding impression on the other world leaders. I mean, everyone from Canada, Germany, France, England, Russia, China, Egypt, all these world leaders got on quite well with Ford. Well enough that when Anwar Sadat was assassinated in the mid-'80s, then President Reagan asked Ford to be one of the U.S. emissaries to his funeral. Reagan had just recently survived his own assassination attempt, so he really, like, his Secret Service was like, you ain't going, Mr. President. Sorry, but no. And so Reagan reached out to Ford, Nixon, and Carter and asked them to go and represent the U.S., and all three did. Now, obviously, Ford was disappointed when he lost in '76 to Carter, but he was a professional. Right? This was the American way, right? The American people had spoken. And so Ford was determined to leave Carter in a better position than Ford had been when he took the position. So Ford began working closely with the transition team. He had like 30 different teams working with Carter's people, preparing briefs for Carter on key issues and policies. The Secret Service vetoed Ford's returning to their house in Alexandria for the same security reasons. They're like, dude, people have already taken shots at you twice. We cannot secure the Alexandria home. You need a better residence, something we can secure. They looked around. They couldn't really return to Michigan because they're getting on in years. They wanted some sunshine in their lives. So they settled on a residence in California and a summer residence in Colorado. They already had a ski residence in Vail, Colorado. They just basically upped the residence to something a little grander and spent their summers in Colorado and then snowbird in California. And it was after he retired and life slowed a bit with room to breathe and Ford was no longer running from national crisis to national crisis. I mean, he was still running a lot because he was a well sought after speaker. When he retired from the presidency, he had like a net worth of $400,000. By the time he passed, he had a net worth of $15 million. So, I mean, the good news is it's entirely possible to drastically increase your net worth as you get older. So anybody who's struggling, at 47, I'm just saying, it gets better. You got a chance. The Ford kids addressed Betty's substance use. Now, her addiction to painkillers can actually be traced to a very specific incident on August 15th, 1964. Like, literally, they can pinpoint to the day when her addiction to substances occurred. She was trying to open a window in the Alexandria, Virginia house and pinched a nerve. The window wouldn't open. She pushed too hard, pinched a nerve. From that point on, she slowly began to develop a dependence on painkillers mixed with alcohol. It's ironic. That's why I said it's ironic that I am saluting her with a gin and tonic. It's entirely possible that without this incident, there would have been no alcohol dependency because the two kind of fed each other, right? Anybody who's ever had a pinched nerve knows just how painful that is. Ever had a pinched sciatic nerve? I have. My heart bleeds for her because that shit hurts. And she's had to keep going with a smile on her face when she was in the White House. The physical demands of a political life, especially after becoming First Lady, I mean, dependency happened. But following a family intervention, she got clean and then famously created the Betty Ford Clinic. And true to form, because Ford supported his wife in everything she ever did, once Betty stopped drinking, Ford stopped drinking. I mean, just stopped. Because as busy as he had been with his political career, he always supported Betty, just as she had always supported him. And this was an outstanding marriage. When she could no longer drink, he just stopped. Because he never had addiction problems. He enjoyed the pleasures of life. For example, another anecdote included in the book is that when his daughter Susan was smoking and he was nagging her about this, he's like, oh, you shouldn't smoke, it's bad for your health. And she said, well, I'll quit smoking cigarettes when you quit smoking pipes. Which he'd literally done all of his life. Well, he said, okay, he packed all of his pipes and sent them to the Presidential Library in Michigan and never smoked again. And he had his pleasures, but no addictions. And he was immensely proud that Betty overcame hers. And this book was well named. Ford was an ordinary man who found himself in extraordinary circumstances. He had an outstanding sense of humor. He laughed at himself a lot. The author recounts one dinner. I mean, people make much about Ford having been very clumsy because, he slipped a few times, slippery shoes, whatever. May have been part of the trick knee from, his college football injury. He actually worked with a humorist. The name is in the book, but I don't remember the name, unfortunately, not off the top of my head. But he worked with a humorist on basically a whole routine. So when he did a dinner. I don't remember which dinner. It wasn't Gridiron, but it was something like that. He like stood up and like ripped the tablecloth off the table and made a whole thing, like tripped over his own feet and gave a speech. And it was one of the ones where like Chevy Chase was there. Chevy Chase famously caricatured him on Saturday Night Live, and Ford stole the show by making fun of himself and his own foibles. And that sense of humor shone through because Chevy Chase eventually ended up going through the Betty Ford clinic for his own addiction to painkillers. He had, heavy physical comedy. He literally took a beating. If you ever watch any old Chevy Chase movies, he gets hit on the head a lot. He had his own addiction to pain pills. Went to the Betty Ford clinic, and Ford sat and talked with him there. And then the two got along quite well because Ford was able to make friends with everybody. He knew the media was going to take all the pictures when he slipped on the steps of Air Force One. I mean, he knew that would make headlines, and they were just doing their job. Ford didn't get mad when, press corps caught pictures of him falling down. They were doing their job, all right? He never got mad about things like that. He just ran with it. And at the time, it was rainy. He was holding an umbrella and holding Betty's arm so she didn't fall, because even though he didn't necessarily know about her addiction and how serious her use of pain pills were, he knew that she had a bad back. He knew she had the pinched nerve. He knew she had arthritis in her spine, and telling me that shit fucking hurts. And so he wanted to make sure that she didn't fall. So he had the umbrella in one hand, his other hand on a wife, and he slipped. And then he apologized to the Chancellor of Germany, Helmut Schmidt, who he was meeting, and just kept going because that's all you can do. I mean, Ford was a deeply honest man. He believed that his mandate was to serve the people. First the 5th District of Michigan, and then of the United States. And he did. To the absolute best of his ability. He served. There is a much shorter book about Ford. This one was 710 pages. There's like a 350-page book written by Donald Rumsfeld. At the time, he actually served under Ford as Ford's Chief of Staff and later as Secretary of Defense. Rumsfeld book is called When the Center Held. I have not read this one. I found that one of the footnotes in this book, the author references Rumsfeld book, where I was like, oh hell, how the hell did I miss that? That would have been way shorter. I'd be done with the book already. But this is the one I want. But I feel like the center of that says a lot. The title of that says a lot. I feel like the title of that says a lot. Ford was a centrist. I mean, member of the Republican Party, but he was center of that party. I mean, from this point on in my presidential journey, we're entering my lived lifetime. And I was born in 1977. I can't claim to recall anything about Jimmy Carter as president, but I definitely have opinions about Reagan on. So Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden. I have opinions about all of them. But after reading this book, I am pretty sure that Ford was the last centrist president that we had. I mean, that seems to me like the country has become more and more divided since Ford left the White House until we have this year's current absolute shit show. I'll finish this up. The husband's not here. He's switching out his work truck, so I gotta finish this up. It's pretty good. I like this book. I enjoyed learning about Ford. I feel like history has vindicated most, if not all, of the decisions that he made while he was in the White House. He was outstanding at compromise and friends with everybody. He didn't let politics get in the way. I mean, people who might probably never voted for him still counted him as friends. If they didn't know him coming in, he made friends with them. One of the earliest things he said when he entered the White House is that he wanted adversaries who weren't enemies. And that's a distinction that most people don't think of. They think if you're against me, you must be my enemy, and he didn't see it that way. He knew that there was a nuance between having a difference of opinion and being a sworn enemy. And he had that. He had adversaries, people who didn't agree with him lockstep, who were still friends, but they weren't enemies at all. I mean, even people who didn't necessarily like him respected him and came to like him. Like I said earlier, when he went to Anwar Sadat's funeral, Jimmy Carter, Richard Nixon joined him. And he and Carter became good friends at this point in time. I mean, good friends. So much so that Carter spoke at his funeral when he passed on December 26, 2006. And that's it for this week. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you guys next Sunday. Bye.